Welcome to Strip Cover Lit. I am Adrian Fort, and we are here for a quickie. This quickie is of Danse Macabre by Stephen King. What is Danse Macabre? It was published in 1981, and I think that there are a couple things worth noting there. One, if I remember correctly, this was published at the request of King's publisher. That is, his publishing house came to him and said, "Hey, Stephen, maybe do this thing for us." And that happened just 7 years after his first novel, Carrie, was published. Meaning that it was just 7 years after his first novel was published that Stephen King was not just an authority on the horror genre, but the authority on the horror genre. Two, Danse Macabre, Roadwork, and Cujo all dropped in 1981. Not quite, perhaps, an Annus Mirabilis, but when you consider that The Running Man, The Gunslinger, and Different Seasons dropped in 1982, as well as 1983, seeing Christine, Pet Sematary, and Cycle of the Werewolf all birthed to the world, it's pretty impressive. And don't get me started on 1987, Stephen King, you monster. Anyway, it is 447 pages through the Books Index. And lastly, and I definitely should have said this earlier, Danse Macabre is Stephen King's treatise on the horror genre. Three great quotes from Danse Macabre. This coming on page 282. First, he quotes the first paragraph of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which is, "No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed, by some, to dream. Hill House was not sane. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against the hills, holding darkness within. It had stood for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and the stone of Hill House. Whatever walked there walked alone." That is from Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. But the quote from Stephen King starts next. "I think there are few, if any, descriptive passages in the English language that are any finer than this. It is the sort of quiet epiphany every writer hopes for. Words that somehow transcend words. Words which add up to a total greater than the sum of the parts. Analysis of such a paragraph is a mean and shoddy trick, and should almost always be left to college and university professors, those lepidopterists of literature, when they see a lovely butterfly, feel that they should immediately run into the field with a net, catch it, kill it, with a drop of chloroform, and mount it on a white board, and put it in a glass case, where it will still be beautiful, and just as dead as horse shit." This quote from 289, "There is, in me, some leftover streak of Puritan ethic, or squinty-eyed Calvinistic morality, that suggests that things must have a point. I dislike everything gratuitous. Evil must not be allowed to get away unpunished, even though I know that it does every day. Ultimately, there must be a day of reckoning for the bad thing, and I still have no idea if this is a strength or a weakness." And a third great quote from a book that's just chock full of them. "This is an exciting, even fundamental change in the intent of the Gothic. Once upon a time, the bad place had been seen by critics as a symbol of the womb, a primarily sexual symbol, which perhaps allowed the Gothic to become a safe way of talking about sexual fears. Park and Malin are suggesting that the new American Gothic, created primarily in the 20 or so years since Shirley Jackson's publishing of the Haunting of Hill House, uses the bad place not to symbolize sexual interest and fear of sex, but interest in the self and the fear of the self. And if anyone should ever ask you why there has been no such bulge in the popularity of horror fiction and horror films over the last 5 years or so, you might point out to your questioner that the rise of the horror film in the 70s and early 80s, and the rise of such things as rolfing, primal screaming, and hot tubbing run pretty much in tandem, and that most of the really popular examples of the horror genre, from The Exorcist to Cronenberg's They Came From Within, are fine examples of the new American Gothic, which we have, instead of a symbolic womb, a symbolic mirror. Sell it with a sentence. Over 40 years, Stephen King has scared the hell out of people, and in that time, he's sold more books than God. So when he talks, you should listen. What are the 3 best things about Danse Macabre? 1, Stephen King has never, ever forgotten anything. 2, this book also includes great quotes from other writers that Stephen King has collected throughout the years, and you have to remember he's never forgotten anything in his life. And 3, this is the 2010 edition, which includes 2 footnotes or 2 footnotes, as well as 2 appendixes. Because of that, we get the feeling that this is still a living, breathing text. The 3 worst things. Remember when you were in middle school and your father woke you in the middle of the night, crying and drunk, of course, and dragged you out of bed because they were playing reruns of Hogan's Heroes, and this episode right here, that was the first time he ever considered that maybe he would have a son as well, and as well as being a son, and it turns out that was the only time that your father ever told you he loved you. And after this strange turn of events, he sends you back to your room while cursing and throwing things, and tells you that if you miss the bus again, he'll castrate you. That's how Stephen King is in this book. Mostly. 2, there are times where this really feels like reading an encyclopedia. And 3, King seems to favor films and even television over literature and books. Perhaps that's because I'm a jealous lover. But to further prove this, Appendix 1 is horror films, and you have to wait until Appendix 2 to get to the books that Stephen King suggests that you should read. 3 lessons learned as I throw things all over. This comes to us from page 434, maybe. The imagination is an eye, a marvelous third eye that flows free. As children, that eye sees with 20/20 clarity. As we grow older, its vision begins to dim. And one day, the guy at the door lets you into the bar without asking to see any ID. And that's it for you, Collie. Your hat is over the windmill. It's in your eyes. Something is in your eyes. Check them out in the mirror and tell me if I'm wrong. The job of the fantasy writer or the horror writer is to bust the walk of that tunnel vision wide for a little while, to provide a single powerful spectacle for the third eye. The job of the fantasy horror writer is to make you, for a little while, a child again. This from 367. All fantasy fiction is essentially about the concept of power. Great fantasy fiction is about people who find it at great cost or lose it tragically. Mediocre fantasy fiction is about people who have it and never lose it, but simply wield it. Mediocre fantasy fiction generally appeals to people who feel a decided shortage of power in their own lives and obtain a vicarious shot of it by reading stories of the strong, thewed barbarians whose extraordinary prowess at fighting is only excelled by their extraordinary prowess at fucking. In these stories, we are apt to encounter a 7-foot-tall hero fighting his way up the alabaster stairs of some ruined temple, flashing a sword in one hand, and a scantily clad beauty lolling over his free arm. And the difference between horror, shock, and terror, which begins on page 3, and this is sort of an extensive quote, so bear with me. If there is any truth or words to the Danse Macabre, it is simply that the novels, movies, TV, and radio programs, even the comic books dealing with horror, always do their work on two levels. On top is the gross-out level, when Regan vomits in the priest's face or masturbates with the crucifix in The Exorcist, or when the raw-looking, terribly inside-out monster in John Frankenheimer's Prophecy crunches off the helicopter pilot's head like a Tootsie Pop. The gross-out can be done in varying degrees of artistic finesse, but it's always there. But on another, more potent level, the work of horror really is a dance, a moving rhythmic search. And what it's looking for is the place where you, the viewer or the reader, live at your most primitive level. The work of horror is not interested in the civilized furniture of our lives. Such a work dances through these rooms, which we have fitted out one piece at a time, each piece expressing, we hope, our socially acceptable and pleasantly enlightened character. It is in search of another place, a room which may sometimes resemble a secret den of Victorian gentlemen, sometimes the torture chamber of the Spanish Inquisition, but perhaps most frequently and most successfully the simple and brutally plain hole of a Stone Age cave dweller. Is horror art? On the second level, the work of horror can be nothing else. It achieves the level of art simply because it is looking for something beyond art, something that predates art. It is looking for what I would call phobic pressure points. The good horror tale will dance its way around the center of your life and find a secret door to the room you believed no one but you knew of. As both Albert Camus and Billy Joel have pointed out, the stranger makes us nervous, but we like to try on his face anyway. And that third level of horror, which is expressed on pages 8 and 9, is terror. Terror, what Hunter Thompson calls fear and loathing, often arises from a pervasive sense of disestablishment, that things are in the unmaking. If that sense of unmaking is sudden and seems personal, if it hits you around the heart, then it lodges in the memory a complete set. Just as the fact almost everyone remembers where he or she was the instant he or she heard the news of the Kennedy assassination is something I find almost as interesting as the fact that one nerd with a mail-order gun was able to change the entire course of world history in just 14 seconds or so. That moment of knowledge and the 3-day spasm that stunned grief which followed is perhaps the closest any people in history has ever come to a total period of mass consciousness and mass empathy and, in retrospect, mass memory. 200 million people in a living freeze. Love cannot achieve more than that, cannot achieve that sort of across-the-board hammer strike of emotion, apparently. More than the pity. Three questions for further discussion. 1, when's that newest revision coming, Stephen? 2, who would you like to see write a Danse Macabre type of book for literary fiction? I honestly don't know how I would answer this question. And 3, those 3 levels of scary stories that we just talked about, are there equal parts for other genres? Also, 3 recommendations. 1, The Art of Fiction by John Gardner. Gardner has the same type of encyclopedic knowledge of the craft as King, and whether you are a writer or not, knowledge of the craft expands the palette for artistic appreciation. 2, On Writing by Stephen King. The first half of On Writing is a memoir, and the second half is sort of a craft book. Danse Macabre feels like it would fit nicely in between those two. And 3, The Best Poems of the English Language is edited by Harold Bloom. I say this because I'm sure King has read it, because King has read everything. And it's the same type of tome as Danse Macabre, but with poetry. Rating? This is difficult to rate because there are times when it's just completely infuriating because Stephen King is just talking about Twilight Zone episodes, and you wonder how long those passages will last, because it's just his favorite parts of his favorite episodes, and there seems to be no point for, I won't say large swaths of this novel, but definitely there are parts in this novel where it's like that. But there are also moments of stunning prescience. All in all, I would give this 87 appendices out of 100.